Happy Thursday. Welcome to Capital D episode 2, where we continue to go and explore design in the age of intelligence. Bring us back. Welcome back, Kaaren. Welcome back, Ben.
Thank you.
Hey, it's becoming a thing now.
Yeah. So last week we talked a lot about, what are the edges and kind of our emerging relationship with AI as it's kind of become everything and everywhere. I think this week we want to go a little bit about some examples of, when do you actually truly lean into it, doing it by yourself versus giving it over to AI? Because I think we're becoming like habitually delegating to AI. So I'm kind of curious to what are you guys seeing? What are you feeling in this space?
Well, and I think that's a really interesting question, Gordon, because I have been observing a little posts on LinkedIn here or there, but there was one that was very memorable about a guy who was sitting on the airplane next to another guy. And that guy was writing performance reviews. And he was doing that by inputting a bunch of stuff from other people as well as from the individual, using ChatGPT and then copying and pasting it. And that was literally the performance review. It wasn't that he was reviewing it. It wasn't that he was thinking through what would have the most impact on this person. If we changed one thing, what would that one thing be? Either for the short term or the long term. It was just copy, paste, and give. And I've heard other anecdotes of this. And that really makes me wonder, when are we outsourcing, if you will, some of the most important work we have to do as a design leader? And I believe firmly that growing your people is some of the most important work you've got. That's the durable legacy you're going to leave. And if we're starting to outsource it because it's so easy for AI to make sense of a bunch of different information and level up some themes, at what point are we no longer doing our job, right? What is core to our job? What do we have to keep doing? And what do we get to outsource? Or how do we leverage it as something to help us as opposed to take over?
Yeah. Just adding to that, another thing that I read this week was this article about this service company offering a service for enterprise companies, going through SOC 2 compliance reports, onboarding as vendors, closing sales deals, and where there's certainly human involvement, but there's also a lot of outsourcing of assessment of these security questionnaires and filling them in with the help of AI. And given that SOC 2 and other certifications had the promise of raising the bar for privacy and security, and ensuring that companies uphold that, right? I think it begs a similar question of where do we outsource not just the work, but also the responsibility? And is that a good thing, right? And going to the point where I think it was a talk video recording that I listened to during the week, was this whole question about it's not about what AI can do, but what should we use it for, right? Only because something can be done doesn't necessarily mean it should be done in the first place. And I think that's the conversation that is not necessarily happening enough, right? Because everyone is in this rat race of just deploying, trying to get it into the product or the platform or what have you. And where the question really becomes, okay, well, what are the implications? What are the effects of us not maybe putting some guardrails in there?
Well, and the way I think about it is we should make sure that we are doing the work that is most meaningful, right? Something like you're talking about making sure it's compliant, that should be meaningful. And that should be something that we're thinking about doing and doing it thoughtfully as opposed to doing it to get by the system. And same with performance reviews. Those should be meaningful and something we truly lean into as opposed to making a restaurant reservation, which is not that meaningful.
Yeah.
At least for me.
There's almost like a word in my head that, as I was listening to both you talk, is is there a convenience trap here? Because it's so easy. It's almost like a temptation to just go there. It's like candy, intellectual candy.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. And also, I think we're being sold as part of this hype cycle, certainly at the moment, that there's these efficiency gains and the speed and convenience and all of that, and that's all really, really good, right? But on the flip side, I think there is something about our abilities or our brain's ability to work only at a certain speed, right? And certain processes make us experience that speed. For example, the creative process, right, where we might run, at a certain speed, but we're not getting anywhere right away. We need to take some loops. We need to ask some questions. We need to figure some things out. And I think that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, agreed. It almost reminds me when you have one tool in your toolbox, it's a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I feel like that's what we're doing with AI.
Yeah.
Do you think, just to put us back maybe a little bit of history, when, social media first came out and the behaviors we see now with the loneliness epidemic, right, and the disconnection. So I'm almost seeing some parallels with the allurement of technology and how the benefits it can bring to us, but also we see compounding effects on our lived experiences as humans over time. And so, we're just starting with AI and we don't fully know yet all the net effects. So I'm kind of curious to how you guys have seen this, evolution.
I was at a lecture at Stanford yesterday, and it was by Kelly McGonigal, and she talks about joy, and she's actually writing a book about joy. And a lot of joy is when your values and the meaning are aligned with what you're doing. And so I think that that's something we have to be really thoughtful about, because it is easy to use AI for everything, as opposed to using AI for the tedious tasks that aren't meaningful. And that's something that we all have to be thoughtful about and really choiceful about. It's not an easy answer.
I agree. And I think that's why it's so important to have these conversations. I think, Kaaren, you said something earlier about, booking a restaurant might not be something that you want to spend a lot of time on. I think for a lot of people, that's the case. For some people, that might actually be something that they find joy in, right? And there's a question about human dignity in all of this that I think is really important, because, there is a sense of accomplishment that we all feel going through certain processes that we things that we do, and sometimes they are hard, and oftentimes the sense of accomplishment increases when something has felt hard, right? And so this outsourcing idea of just like outsourcing things because they're mechanical things, they're repetitive, that you don't have to do them, is fine, but
Yeah,
I think there should be more conversation about, well, how do we assess for the human implications that are maybe more long term, maybe more second, third order effects.
I have a prompt. So I came across this quote and it says, artists create beauty through pain. And I was thinking about this because I actually, Kaaren, to your point about leaders outsourcing performance reviews, I hear it's a painful, long, especially with a very large team, it's a long process. But what do you lose when you delegate that away in making sense of the people around you? And so I'm thinking whether it's a performance review situation or some other thing, as leaders, we go through trials and pains, and then there's greatness that comes as a result of that because we've gone through the process. So I'm kind of curious for both of you, like, what are some other instances as a leader that might be areas that are not worth delegating, or how do you find the right balance between the lines?
It's a really good question.
I can answer partially just because I just came out of a class meeting with one of my students, and the module specifically was around leadership, right? And how do you lead a team? And these are startup students, student startups, students that run startups that learn how to lead some very small teams. And one of the conversations was about how do you learn about what your teammates are motivated by. And the one thing that I think a lot of students these days do, they type these questions into GPT, right? And they will get back some generic explanation. They might even get back some step-by-step tools of how to go about having conversations. But in the class, what we dug deeper into was, well, what motivates you as the individual student? Why are you doing the thing that you're doing? And it turns out, well, oftentimes there's something family related, upbringing related, right? And feeling through and understanding those things that drive you as a human will allow you to approach leadership situations in a very different way, because you're dealing with individuals, one-to-one. And no matter how good GPT or any AI system is, and giving you the step-by-step guide and even the phrasing and having the conversations with your teammates, without you being forced through the pain, or at least certainly the internal reflections, without that, it's not authentic. It's not going to lead to really unlocking the best in the people that we lead or that we work with. And so I don't know if that really answers the question per se, but I think it certainly, for me, was a moment where I was like, okay, there's a lot here when we're talking about outsourcing to computer systems, what is really truly uniquely human.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You say, I was meeting with a designer a couple weeks ago, and she has done a lot with AI and storyboarding, and she is using AI to do fabulous storyboards. But what she continues to focus her brain on is how to, like, the meaning behind those storyboards and what is the actual story theme, right? And so she's leveraging it in a really interesting way, but she's leveraging it in a way to accelerate her thinking and processing and her communication, as opposed to abdicating it, right? And I think that's what we have to be careful, is make sure we're not abdicating something.
I like that. And it leads me down a path where I've been spending quite a bit of time the last few months, is in order for her to be able to even discern, right? There's a real foundational level of critical thinking, of value system, on decision-making frameworks that are required to then be able to do that work, which I think is the way we should be using these systems to maximize our impact, to maximize our creative abilities.
But it is interesting, Gordon, back to what you started off with. Well, hey, how is this like social media or not like social media? Because there are all these unintended consequences of social media, whether it's FOMO, it's more loneliness or whatnot. And I know there's a little bit of debate about, is that real or not? But let's assume that it is largely real. How do we make sure that we are not inadvertently losing the impact or losing the meaning or losing the connection that we have to the value that we bring? I think that those are some very concerning potential problems.
So I think a little bit like, when social media first came out, I was a teenager, right? And I was all about it. And it kind of feels like the moment now, except I'm much older than, when I first got my hands on my first smartphone, and then got absorbed into it. And I thought back then it was like this great tool to meet new people, show your life in different ways, and just a new medium for expression. But as I got older and social media had changed the relationship with me, where I'm like, oh my God, the amount of screen time and the nervousness or anxiety or just the sheer amount of overwhelm that you get from a device like that is incredibly powerful. It can be both good and bad. And so now I'm thinking about AI, it's like there's a bit of this like shiny effect right now. We're all excited, we're all playing with it. But I really think about like, what are those, to your point, Ben, second, third order effects? And especially when I think about design teams today, is like, how is that going to change our creativity, our workflow, the quality of the products we create? And how do you really figure out the right balance between automation, augmentation, or maybe just complete, displacement of the thing that, maybe is not worth our time? So.
Yeah. I think it's extremely exciting what's happening, right? There's no question about that. And part of answering the question will be playing with these technologies and experimenting, right? Just like we have with all other new tools that we've ever produced as humans. And I think artists, creatives, designers are all uniquely positioned to explore really the edges of new technologies. But part of that exploration also, as artists have always done, is to explore not just the positives, right? But also be really serious about the negatives. And I think if there's one thing about social media that we have seen and where we should be cautious of, is this move fast and break things attitude has gotten us into true human trouble. People have gotten hurt. Lots of teenagers are really not feeling good. And we have the data to prove that, right? We have a technology now that is even more powerful, more wide reaching, right? The scale and speed of it is much bigger. It has much greater implications. So I think part of the exploration, part of the creative exploration should also be to think about the negative side effects of all.
Yeah, and towards that end, being really intentional, right? I mean, Gordon, I think that your story of using social media all the time and then really pulling back and realizing it's useful in bits, but not, you don't want to live your whole life in social media, right? I think that's
right.
going to be where we're all each going to find the boundaries ourselves. But the more intentional we can be about it, the better off we're all going to be.
Mm-hmm. And there's a question about, what skills do we need to build all the way from, children all the way to professionals in discerning and making these very intentional decisions. That is going to be really interesting.
Maybe there's a takeaway here and also a prompt is how might we become more intentional in the age of AI when things become so convenient, so easy. And Kaaren, I'm really reflecting also, it's like, how do we feel like we're actually deriving more meaning in our lives as a result of technology, right? Not just speed or, the pace of things, but also the meaning we have with the world around us. And so I'm almost seeing there's like a bit of intentionality, meaning, and how that intersects with the age of AI.
Yeah, I almost think that we pursue meaning and we pursue joy and we leverage AI to help us in that.
Yeah.
But we can't lose our purpose of being human, right? Which is often making meaning. It is often helping others and creating joy. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to create joy.
I think that's a super, super important statement, realization that is very often lost in the very technologically driven public conversation right now.
So I think maybe one practical thing I truly have thought over the last 2 years of being a founder myself, I have found like the practice of intentionality, reflecting, meditation, journaling, like all those things are even more important if you're in a role that is intense. You're forced to grow really fast. And I think no different than any organization, similar, they're also going through massive change. And so what does it mean to raise the collective intentionality and mindfulness of an organization, right? Not only ourselves, but as leaders, how do we help our teams do that?
Right. And how do we help other people believe it's valuable? Because if people don't believe it's valuable, they're not going to do it at all. And especially when there's so much excitement and froth, right?
That's right. But I also think about, designers in leadership teams. Is that something we can bring?
And can we bring it in a way, and I go back to one of the things that Kaaren said last time we spoke, can we bring it in a way that is constructive, additive, right? Because there's a certain dominant narrative. Oftentimes when you bring up questions like, okay, well, what are the potential downsides? What are the second and third order effects? There can very quickly become, there can be this hesitation, or it feels like you're slowing things down and you're not contributing to, the business moving as fast as it can. And I think learning how to phrase these things and contribute to the conversation in a way that it is additive, that it is constructive, and hopefully gets people more broadly to think about the implications, I think is a critical skill to build, and not easy. I think we've all probably been in situations as design leaders specifically, when at least initially there's a conflict perceived, although typically these things aren't in conflict, but it goes back to motivation, what are incentives, and so on and so forth.
Maybe something to kind of think about in this last part of our episode is I was looking at this chart from Our World, Our Data, and it showed the time scale of technological change.
Oh, can you share it with us?
And I'll share it with you and all the audiences. And it shows a bit of a spiral. And it took millennia for us to arrive at the technologies we're using now, right? From fire to steam engine. And then you think about what AI is doing now is it's actually compressing time scales so that we're achieving advancement at a pace that we have never seen before. So space exploration, curing, diseases. So I think about this concept of compression, denser, and it also means decisions we make now have larger implications. So maybe a prompt to both of you is like, how can companies and teams enhance decision making in this era, knowing what we just said, given that we now know implications are only increasing?
Well, I think about a framework. I can't remember who started this, but I've heard about it regularly throughout my career. But what's a one-way door and what's a two-way door? There are some decisions you make and you can't back out of them. And those are decisions you have to be really, really thoughtful about. And there are other decisions, watch and learn. Right? It's not that hard to change. So I think it's about us being, again, very deliberate and intentional about what is more of a one-way door and what is just not so hard to shift.
Yeah, I like that framework. I had not heard of that before. I think it's a great way to visualize, decision making and different avenues. I would probably just add to that something that might sound simplistic at first, but I've not seen it happening enough, and that would be to even ask the question: what's the worst thing that could happen? Truly, for the humans that are exposed to this, right? Because what I've seen, especially in large organizations, but certainly also in startups, now that I think about it, is that because you have to often sell the idea and get people on board, it would almost be counterproductive to also add the potential negative effects of something. And I think the bigger the stakes, the bigger the sell, and oftentimes we don't ask enough, well, what is the worst thing that could happen here? And I think that needs to become a general framework for, especially now, making bigger bets on transformative technologies.
So you're almost thinking about it in like I guess in a business world, it's like risk, right? Like what are the risks that this project or innovation brings, and how do we avoid, like, because I think one thing, we're talking about here is like getting more intentional with decisions, not only the benefits, but what could go wrong. And if those things could happen, how do we avoid the possibility of those futures unfolding? And so it's a bit of practice of foresight here in scenarios. Is that kind of what you're...
Yeah, although, I'm cautious on that front, because when I think about Facebook when it was first started, did anybody think, oh, well, the danger is we're all going to be really lonesome? Or the danger is girls are going to have really bad body images. And I don't think that was in the sphere of what people were thinking of at all. And so I also wonder if it's not more just the guardrails. Like, come on, what's his name? John Doerr. He has a book called Measure What Matters. And he talks a lot about Google, at least when he was involved, they would have a metric they were striving for, but also a counter metric. So it might be a way of bringing into those metrics, great, what is it we're trying to solve for? What are we trying to make sure we're not inadvertently doing?
Yes, I think it's not an either or. I think it's an and, because to the Facebook example, I think alarm bells went off way earlier than most.
Than we were told, but not on day one.
No,
not
absolutely.
on day one, not on day 1,000.
Which is why I think we need to make it a habit to ask these questions all the time. And countermeasure or measurement of the actual success metric and the counter success metric is going to help, especially in organizations that are very metrics or measurement driven. But I think it's more than that. Just in the last episode of On with Kara Swisher, they talk about the Facebook example quite extensively with people that were there, and where I think it's cultural, of course, at the end of the day, and the way you change the culture is by changing the habits, right? And so that's part of what I'm advocating for, is it's building it into the discussion frameworks, into the way risk is assessed, opportunities are assessed, that second and third order effects, unintended consequences become part of the assessment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's fair. Good questions, Gordon. I love it.
And I think this is a good place to maybe wrap it up here, because I think there's a lot of follow-up we need to investigate. And I think, Kaaren, we, last week we're inspired by learning more about the practice of futures, right? And how that might fold into strategic design practices. So I think in our next week episodes, we're going to continue to collect more anecdotes, examples, see what's happening, and continue to make sense. And I actually thought one thing is in an era of so much ambiguity and change, simply having a conversation is extremely helpful. I don't think these reports or surveys they have a place, but also just pure conversation. So thank you both for showing up again today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.